in the area of digital technologies, teacher education, language education, applied linguistics, and those sorts of spaces. So I think, as John has alluded to already, one of the things, apart from you actually knowing what you want to communicate to your audience, is the choice of the publication through which you wish to do so. And although he didn't say so, it is, of course, perfectly clear that peer-reviewed journals are one very, very important type of outlet for your work. There is, of course, also book publications and chapters within books, which shouldn't be discounted. And we can come on to that later on. But writing for books, I think, is quite different to writing for journals, for reasons that we may go into in a moment. So one of the very, very important things about coming to the notice of journal editors is making sure that you have a real understanding what types of articles the journal that you're submitting to actually tends to publish. And there is two very, very important ways of ascertaining that. If you look at the publication that I've given you and turn it round, you will find that at the back you see something called the aims and scope statement. Most journals have such an aims and scope statement, in which the editors and the editorial board of a journal try to communicate, broadly speaking, the types of activities that they tend to, themes and topics that they tend to be comfortable with for their journals, and think that are relevant for the readership. And unless you really, really feel that what you want to communicate firmly fits within the aims and scope of the journal, don't bother submitting it. Yeah? You'll save yourself a lot of time. As John will know from periodic emails that I sent to him, one of the really, really important jobs of an editor is to make sure that any contributions in a journal meet the very highest standards of quality in the field. And journals tend to do so by enlisting the support of reviewers. And by and large, if they wanted to call themselves sort of peer-reviewed, each and every contribution gets read anonymously by two independent reviewers. And to manage this is a massive, massive undertaking, which most journal editorial teams do for nothing, yeah, as their contribution to the field. So one of the first things journal editors will do is they will look at a paper that comes in, and they will take a view as to whether or not, broadly speaking, it fits within the aims and scope. If it doesn't, it'll get rejected straight away. Yeah? And you won't even get the benefit of a reviewer looking at it. So in the case of this particular journal here, you will find that at this point in time, when I last checked, the acceptance rate was around about 13%, 1-3. Yeah. So that can either mean it's of extremely high quality, and of course I'd tell you yes it is. But it can also mean that you get loads and loads of people submitting who shouldn't be submitting, and there's always a little bit of that as well. But it also, one other factor is, how many issues within a volume, how many pages, in other words, does an editor have at his or her disposal to fill in every 1 year. As you won't be surprised, journal publication by and large is part of a bigger commercial enterprise, and journal editors get an allocation of space, which they either have to fill or they're not allowed to fill more of it. Yeah? So the closer the alignment of what you submit to the aims and scope, the better. So it may not be, when you get rejected, a question of what you have to say not be of interest or not being of any quality, but it may just not be the best fit. So once you've looked at the aims and scope statement at the back, I think it's then really, really helpful not just to have a look at one issue, but to go back a year or two and say, well, let's read some of these papers now. What types of contributions beyond the overarching themes and topics that are listed here does a paper tend to, a journal tend to accept? And then you'll get a feel very quickly for the extent to which journals will expect very, very strongly quantitative statistical types of orientation, or the extent to which they're happier with more broadly qualitative types of approaches. The extent to which, in this particular context, for example, the journal is happy to deal with aspects of vocabulary teaching, of learning strategies. Yeah? I could fill this journal, many times over with papers on vocabulary teaching and learning strategy. But it isn't a vocabulary learning journal, it isn't a learning strategies journal, yeah? It's a language learning journal. So even if there are some very good contributions, often choices will have to be made. So as John said, don't get too disheartened. It may have nothing to do with the quality of your contribution. It may simply be a question of the wrong tactics, as it were. Yeah? The match not being. The other thing that I would look, and so you look through the history and then you will see what else does a journal do. Does a journal, for example, offer special issues, or does it only accept contributions that are unsolicited? Sometimes, or particularly when special issues are available, journals will tend to offer calls for paper. And that, by its very nature, can tend to narrow down the, or increase, to look at it conversely, your chances of being considered quite significantly, because fortuitously there might be quite a close match between the area that you're working on and the thematic orientation that a special issue is looking for. So I think that's certainly something very worthwhile looking out for, is what special issues are upcoming. And given that it normally takes, at the very, very least, somewhere in the issue of around 18 months to get it to print, there's often quite a significant amount of time available for you to plan and to make sure that the way in which you frame specific papers may meet the aspirations or expectations of a journal by virtue of the nature of the call for papers that has gone out. So it's then clearly important not just to look at one journal, but to look at a range of different journals to make a judgment as to what the best fit may be. And as I just alluded to, if a particular journal has tended to publish quite a number of papers on topic X, it may mean there is a very sort of strong interest in that area, and the journal is particularly interested in getting more such papers, or it could mean that the particular activity has been saturated and they want to move on to something else and have a balance. That's obviously very difficult to guess for you. And some editors, such as myself, much prefer to receive an email from a potential contributor saying, look, I'm working on this. does this fit, rather than receiving something in my manuscript center, or whatever it's called, environment. And so I can say, okay, broadly speaking, usually the way this goes is somebody writes an email, this is the title, and then I say, yes or no. If I say yes, okay, can you send me an abstract? Yeah? And then yes, and okay, I'll have a look at the paper as well. By which point I know, okay, when this comes in, that's certainly something that we'd be happy with, and then it makes the process much easier. And I don't either then have to, make very high stakes decisions when first looking at the paper, whether or not it should be sent out for review. Not all journals will do that, but for you it means one email, yeah. And if that's wasted effort, then not much is lost really, yeah. But you can save yourself quite some time. So that may be something else to do. But looking at different journals to get a feel for which might be the best. And then and the important thing there is you should try and do that before you sit down to write, or certainly before you finalize your paper. Have a clear sense, this is the journal I'm writing for. This is the type of audience that this journal is trying to speak to, and therefore this is how I best frame my contribution. The other thing that I would look out for, particularly if I were in your position, I'm assuming not particularly experienced published authors just yet, is to look for journals that may be more sympathetic towards early careers contributors than others. If you look at this particular journal that I've shown you there, the Language Learning Journal, you will see on the strapline below, it says the journal of the Association for Language Learning. Okay, that's just the strapline, but it means something quite significant. It means that we as editors are entrusted by the professional association who owns the journal to try and contribute in our ways as editors to developing capacity within the profession in the space of language learning and language teaching. So we, as editors of this particular journal, make it our particular mission to try and be as supportive as possible to contributors. So where we think there is potential, where we think there is fit, there is a message that's relevant to our readership, we are often quite prepared to not just reject a piece when it comes in, but to engage in a dialogue with authors, which means that we write back, encourage revisions, write back a second time, encourage further revisions. So there's a dialogue with the author to make this work. Other journals, such as I imagine the leading journals in the field in the States, such as the Modern Language Journal, you're very unlikely going to get that, yeah? Because they haven't got that sort of a mission. So that may be something else to look out for. Yeah? What type of journal is it? What's its mission? What's its position in the marketplace, if you like? So what happens then? You submit the paper, it comes in for this particular journal, just to give you a sort of broad sense. Every week or so, I would receive 5 to 10 submissions for unique submissions to the journal. And so that means, from a market perspective, John, that I'll be having to read those 5 submissions and make a decision as to whether or not I want to send it out for review, or whether I don't want to send it out for review. So that then means the first thing I'll do, but not the only thing I'll do, but the first thing I'll do is I will look at the abstract, and I will look at the title. And then I'd like to need to see from the abstract, that there's something compelling going on here, that's something interesting that may appeal to my readership. And I've got a very clear sense of who my readership is. I sit down with the publishers once a term or once every half year together with my editorial board, and they give me a publisher's report which sets out, which tells me exactly what type of papers get downloaded, which ones get, obviously I don't know which ones get read, but downloading is the proxy for that. You can see online, and I might show you that in a minute, how often papers get viewed and clicked. I get to see what particular jurisdictions, what countries my readers come from, and all the rest of it. And on the basis of that, and I clearly don't know them all personally, but I think I've got a very good sense of who the readership is. I look at the abstract and say, is that a good fit? And the more work you can do trying to understand what the journal is, who it speaks to, and how your abstract fits into that, the better, because a topic might be really, really important to you. You may have invested 4 years of your life, studying this area, but there needs to be a compelling story there. And then I will read the paper and have a look. So assuming it's past that hurdle, then I will have to think about who do I send this to in terms of reviewers, and I will identify 2 independent individuals to look at this paper. And again, I have, and as will be obvious from the website, or indeed if you look at the inside of this particular printed version, we get a whole list of names here of people. These are the sorts of people, not exclusively, but who I tend to use more often than not to send papers to review. So if you think I'm working in area X and want to submit my paper to journal Y, then let's have a look at journal Y and see what types of people are associated with this journal. And if they are in my area, what type of work do they do? So it's obviously you have no guarantee that the paper will be then sent to this particular person, but there is a certain likelihood that it will be sent to somebody who shares a certain perspective or view about the issue in hand with the types of researchers that are associated with the journal. So some really, really strategic authors, would go as far as to making sure that some members of the editorial board are being quoted and the editor is being quoted. I myself don't fall for that sort of thing particularly, but one of the things that can happen, of course, is that if, as we hope for, of course, there is sort of novel things coming through in papers, areas that we may not have covered all that often in the journal yet, where we haven't got an established reviewer pool just yet, we might well have a look at the references of a particular paper and say, so what type of people does this person quote here? Who do they refer to? Well, let's see whether one of them might be willing to review this paper. So there are some ways as a contributor where you can try to sort of influence the thinking of the editorial team around how this stuff gets channeled. There's of course no guarantee that will happen. And then coming back to the point I made about the affiliation of this particular journal to the Association for Language Learning, given then that when I select reviewers, when I select the editorial team, I tend to select people who share this sort of commitment to promoting the discipline, and John included here, where you will tend to get feedback that is constructive, as opposed to feedback, that's telling you what's wrong with this. So I do quite a bit of work with my referees over time to get them to frame their comments in a way that's constructive and supportive. And I think in all my time, when did I say 1999? You work out the years that I've been associated as editor with this journal. I remember one paper that didn't require review or some changes. Yeah, only one single paper. And if you look through the years, we've had all the eminent leaders, thought leaders in the field published here. So if you get a message back saying, "Great, but," yeah, don't be disheartened. Yeah, there obviously people have spent a lot of time thinking about giving you advice and support. And whilst you may not agree with everything, try to engage constructively with the feedback that you receive. Although some journals don't really require this as a must, very often reviewers are really, really happy to be reminded as clearly as possible about what they said originally. Because by the time that you've made your revisions and you submitted them, very often a few months have passed, yeah? And the reviewer might have a very hazy recollection of what the original paper was like. But I quite frequently get emails back from reviewers that said, "Oh, can't remember where I put my original comments, can you remind me," sort of thing. Yeah? And I oblige, other editors may not. So what very often then the contributors to the language learning journal do is, and they're encouraged to do, is not only mark up the changes very, very clearly, so they submit two versions, a clean version, as well as a marked up version, that gives the reviewer a chance to really look at what changes have been made, and or some of you who are in the sort of latter stages of your PGR study might know, a table that sets out, you said this, I've done that, yeah? in a tabular form. That's always often quite welcome by reviewers. And the more you can sort of signpost and signal to the reviewer that you valued the time that they've inputted in this and taken, doesn't mean accept everything they said, but constructively engaged with their comments, including where you don't agree, explain why you haven't done it. Yeah? That can also then help considerably for the reviewer to understand where you're coming from and so forth. So the one thing that tends not to be welcomed all that much is if a set of comments comes back and within 2 days a revised version is submitted. Yeah, that usually, unless it's really about a comma here, a full stop there. Yeah, which our copy editor would deal with anyway. Yeah, usually suggests there's insufficient engagement. So going away, thinking about the comments, letting them sink in, thinking about how best to tackle them. That takes some time, and it's usually really important for you to take that time, and it pays off. The other thing probably to say is that given the numbers of submissions we get, given the numbers of journals in this space that exist out there, the number of reviewers, potential reviewers, is finite. Yeah? Which means that, and reviewers, as you all know, tend to be academics who tend to have duties such as teach students, mark students, scripts, prepare lectures, and do all sorts of other stuff. They will only have a finite amount of time. So whilst, of course, from your perspective, any given manuscript is probably the most important thing you will have done, certainly will have done in the sort of at the time of submitting. for the reviewer, it's one of many other things that they have to do, which is why we tend to sort of say between 4 and 6 weeks turnaround for reviews. And so if it takes 6 rather than 4 weeks, don't think that that now means that your manuscript isn't valued and all the rest of it. It's simply how it fits into the sort of life-work balance of reviewers. But usually, the sort of submission online systems that publishers have, will give you feedback anyway around, whether this has been looked at by the editor, whether it's been processed, and so forth. So don't chase the journal if you haven't heard back within the window that you've been given. If it goes beyond that, you may want to sort of send a gentle reminder. So let me pause at this point and let me open it up for some questions to you, and I'll try and respond as best I can. Please.
Is there a website that we can see the turnover rate, and then the ranking of journals and everything?
There are websites like that. I sort of can't say I tend to be an avid follower of these websites, simply because I have developed over time a reasonably good understanding of what the journals are that I deal with. My personal strategy, for what it's worth, is that I have an RSS feed to which, so I'm subscribed to somewhere in the region of, I don't know, 100, 150 journals in the 3-4 disciplines that I am interested in, and I get, depending on the nature of the journal, usually a table of content alerts in the form of individual articles. And by reading those over time, I get a really good feel for what's going on with which journal. But obviously, you will have to sit down at one particular point in time and make an assessment as to which journals may or may not be relevant. Yes, of course, as we've alluded to, the issue of ranking does come up quite frequently, and it depends what particular country you come from, where they're more or less important. So if, for example, you were from Australia and you were an academic in Australia wanting to publish not just to enhance our knowledge in a particular field, but also to gain some progression in your career, you'd be guided by the particular rankings that the Australian government or relevant research council stipulates. And that has an impact and an influence on where people publish. But I think here in the UK, certainly, the research excellence framework does not operate a particular index of journals. What really matters is the judgment of quality as per peer reviewers. So you'd obviously have to be guided. Some institutions internationally also have journals that they prefer, and others they don't prefer. But particularly at the beginning of your career, I think it's really important. I think for you to get your work out there into journals that are internationally recognized and not by the domain, the community, as opposed to ranked in particular ways. And let's be quite clear that these rankings are hugely problematical in terms of the commercial drivers that underpin them. Yeah? They're not necessarily a uniformly acknowledged quality mark. Yeah? So I think one really needs to look at what type of people publish in what types of journal. Is that the type of peer group who I want to be known by? Yeah? Because if somebody publishes in a particular journal, you can more or less infer that they read that journal as well. Yeah, and becoming recognized in those sorts of ways might be as important as having particular impact factors associated with particular journals. Yeah.
I have two questions. The first one is just out of pure curiosity. Who was the author of that article who didn't require any correction?
Oh, I have no idea.
No?
I can't remember.
Just curious. And the second is actually, well, this thing about publishing articles looks to me like, these job ads, which require recently graduated professional with 10 years of experience, and accept a lot of skills. So what is your advice in this sense as young scholars who in publishing, but we don't have the tools. We don't expect to publish in, the highly listed journal, right? But at the same time, we do require a certain quality in our publications.
Yeah,
And that quality, I don't know if fortunately or unfortunately, is measured through the type of journal you publish.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a very interesting question. The language learning journal started out as a professional journal at the time of me taking it over. Yeah? Now it's one of the world leading academic peer-reviewed journals in the field. So it's undergone a considerable transition. And the fact that I have material for the journal for the next 3 years. Speaks to its recognition in the field. However, what we've tried to retain is the support for emerging researchers. Yeah? So we're trying to do both things. Yeah? We're trying to help our authors by offering an environment that is recognized as being high quality, as well as putting in the support to help them to get there very quickly. Because we recognize, of course, that PhD thesis in particular can provide a really, really useful wealth of potential data. But it has also got to be said that many of the papers that get rejected are based on PhD studies because the author hasn't really recognized that writing for a journal requires significant reframing of material in a thesis. Yeah? So if you are undertaking doctoral research, by and large, you have what's required to be published successfully because the program teaches you the skills and the techniques, hopefully equips you with the conceptual clarity needed, with an understanding of the theoretical framing to underpin that, how to go about framing research questions that identify gaps in the existing knowledge, teaching you how to develop data collection strategies and methods that are appropriate, give you the skills to bring analytical frames to bear to interpret the data, and so forth. That's all things that a journal will expect of you. But the genre of a journal article is very different to the journal or the thesis. So you will need to be prepared to do the translational work, and very often also be prepared to think about 2 or 3 different articles or papers that you can get out of the thesis, focusing on different sub-questions, rather than thinking that you're gonna just condense everything into one paper. Often that fails as an exercise. So I wouldn't be too negative about the qualities that as a PGR student you bring. Quite the opposite. Yeah? But it's really a question of thinking really, really hard. How do I communicate my methods in a journal article where, by and large, a journal will not accept more than maybe 3 paragraphs about research methods, yeah? Because you just have 6,000 words as opposed to 80,000 words. Yeah? And really doing that hard thinking. So don't think, oh, I'll sit down for one afternoon and do a bit of cut and paste. That's not going to do it. Yeah? You have to invest quite a number of days, often weeks, into reframing that. But do work from the basis that you're got a very strong starting point to really compete with a whole range of other people who may already have published and who may have all sorts of experience, but who will not have had the sort of detailed support and advice that I know colleagues like John give you as part of the dissertation support and supervision session.
Can I just say, I mean, exactly, I really agree with what Norbert was just saying. I think you should aim high. But again, your supervisor can often be involved in this. You can run ideas by the supervisor and then be prepared to read a draft. Or even you can do joint work with your supervisor sometimes. You know, I'm thinking of all the students in our group, for example, are doing that at the moment. So, you know, but as Norbert says, it is that the cutting and paste, you can tell immediately when you see cutting and paste. So I think there is a translation to be done from the kind of thesis kind of work to a journal article.
I think your colleague next to you had a question. Yeah.
Yeah, my question was actually about this journal and when do you accept, let's say, titles, abstract, when is the publishing period for you?
I think you will find with most journal, you know, any of these 365 or 366 days of the year is as good as the other. Yeah. So whenever you are ready, whenever, as I said, you know, I've got a publishing schedule that reaches 3 years out. In this particular journal, as soon as something is accepted, it goes live on the web, is accessible to everybody, is published. It then at some point gets stuck into an issue, which is of no relevance really to anybody other than those who really want to see a paper copy of their output. So it's a perpetual sort of process that happens all the time.
It doesn't have to be on the paper.
The one thing that I didn't say earlier on that you should pay attention to is because of space being an ingredient, journals will be quite clear about the length that they're expecting, the extent to which they're expecting appendices or not, in terms of questionnaires or tools or whatever. Very often journals don't really want to see that because there's not enough space. So you need to find a way of talking about it meaningfully in the body of your text. The type of referencing style, because the last thing you want is journal being happy with what you say, but not so happy with the formatting, and all of that. So if there's a template or if there's a style guide or whatever it is, there usually is a section on a journal which says author's guidance or whatever it's called there, and do look at that as well. Any other questions? I don't know whether we'll.
I just make a comment, Norbert, while you're doing that, and maybe get your opinion on it. I mean, one of the things that it took me a long time to realize was that when you send something in and you get the feedback, I mean, very often as students, we think of feedback as from a teacher or someone like that, so that your work is almost in a way corrected by somebody else. But of course, with peer review, it's your peers that are looking at this. And I think we are entitled to say, thank you for your comments, they're really helpful. With regard to point 6, I would like to say, and actually argue back and say, I would like to keep this the way it is for the following reasons, because sometimes the peer reviewer may not have understood the point that you were making. So when you see comments that they're asking that if you think this is what they want me to do, very often you may not want to do that for reasons that are perhaps not clear. I don't know what you feel about that.
Yes, absolutely,
editor,
and I think that's what I said earlier on, that if there are areas that you don't agree with, then be clear why you haven't acted on it, that you've heard what they've said, but there are good reasons why you decided not to act on it. I think that's perfectly sort of appropriate. But let me just illustrate one or two of the points that I've made earlier on with reference to the actual online interface. So I think one of the things that I alluded to is familiarity with the journal, understand which journal you're writing for. And the easiest way I find to do this is to subscribe to the RSS feed of a journal, which by and large means that you'll get through to you the title, the author, and the abstract, and then you can click and get the full paper if you really wanted to. Coming back to your point just now, that of course peer review is anonymous, so neither the reviewer knows who the author is, nor will you ever know who the reviewers were. And one of my jobs, and that's one I take really, really seriously, given the ethos we have for the journal, is to go through the types of comments that our reviewers make and make absolutely sure that what is being said constructively. So if you were to submit to this journal, there shouldn't be ever an instance where you feel that feedback isn't constructive. I've submitted to other journals where I didn't necessarily feel that was the case, but I don't think that helps anyone. And then of course, as I said, you can look at, so who's the editorial board, what does the journal say about itself, what are the instructions for authors, really important, aims and scope we've talked about. But if you then want to get a sense of what the readership of a particular journal likes, you can look through here the latest articles. So these have been accepted, but they haven't been assigned to any particular volume yet. But if you look through here, for example, you can see this particular piece already hasn't been up all that long, since September, has already got 123 views and an all-metric score of 9. So on social media, there's already some activity happening around that. So if you want to get a sense for what are the sorts of things that the readership are really interested in, you can do that by looking through this particular list. And then anybody know what this means? This means it's open access. So the authors have actually paid either through with their research grant or through their institution to ensure that you don't need to have a subscription as author to read this. So what there tends to happen, of course, is that it drives up the views. It isn't sort of, it's a combination here of this being a very sort of key topic for the German, for the UK audience in particular, as well as it being open access that drives this. So it's worth you having a quick look at the journal and what it says about itself. Other than that, you will find that this journal, as well as many others, will tend to be international journals. That means the readership is international. That means that anybody, say, from China will not probably have a very, very detailed knowledge about the Turkish education system, should you happen to be working on a topic that focuses on particular aspects of the Turkish education system. That does not then mean that you have to give a 2,000 word introduction to the Turkish education system, but you have to say enough to enable a reader to be able to understand what you're trying to do in that sort of space. And it also, I think, it applies to the way in which you reframe your engagement with your topics. And that applies to PhD studies quite often, as well as other contributions. Often, the originality and the significance of individual pieces in the mind of contributors can be framed, amongst other things, by relevance to local context. And that's not necessarily a differentiator in terms of significance for a journal, international journal like this, or indeed usually for a panel that examines PhDs. It's about what is known in the field and how does what you write about contribute to the existing knowledge in the field. So some journals, this one doesn't do it, but some journals actually require authors to set out in a front piece what's new, what's already known in the field, and how what you do contributes to it. There's a few technology journals that I read. I think Computers and Education does that. That requires you to do that. But even where the journal doesn't require you to do this, this is something really helpful for you to think about. Just because nobody has ever looked at a learning strategy X as identified by typology Y in this particular context in country Z, doesn't mean that it's of relevance and importance to the field. It's really important that the significance comes from elsewhere, and that there is a degree of generalizability and transferability. In the context of this journal, that's particularly relevant because what this journal is trying to do, whilst it does accept studies, of course, that focus on English as the language of instruction, it also tries to foreground a strong focus on languages other than English, European languages, less widely taught languages, and so forth. So if you write about certain phenomena in language X, which may have, in terms of a language researcher, teacher, and so forth audience, quite a narrowly defined sort of fan base, as it were, it's really, really helpful to try and abstract from your writing certain aspects that make what you say transferable to other readers who operate in different contexts and with different languages. Or if you were to do it in a technology context, what you learn researching a particular phenomenon with a particular type of technology, might apply to other contexts using other types of technology. Any other questions?
I do have a quick question. There's that rumor among students about publishing.
Yeah.
And they always refer to what we call networking.
Yeah.
As a kind of thing that may support you publishing certain
Yes.
things. Could you go on that?
Well, okay, I'm not sure that what I'm going to say now 100% answers your point. But, so I think the last time John and I were in one room was in July in Southampton. Yeah, when John spoke at a conference, and so did I. And I spoke to a sort of audience of emerging researchers about how to get published in the language learning journal. Attending networking events such as conferences can be extremely helpful in the sense that more often than not, particular conferences are trying to then have special issues or publications associated and linked with those events. So if you've attended, not only can you find out what's going on at any particular point in time in a field, and if you're writing in this, it'll help you improve the framing of your piece. But if you actually presented at a conference, the chances of you getting published are that much higher, because if it's a question of your paper out of a potential other 50 papers, as opposed to your paper out of a potential 1,000 papers, it's obviously the likelihood is much higher. So also having people in the audience tend to have all sorts of roles, as editors maybe, as reviewers, as members of editorial boards, and if they like something they hear, they might well come up to you and say, have you thought about publishing here? And obviously knowing the sort of discourse conventions in the field, being able to ask for clarification, or in the case of presenting papers, getting feedback from networks and peer groups in a sort of less high stakes way than submitting a paper to a journal, I think can be quite beneficial as well. Does that answer your? Yeah.
I think we've got a minute to go, so given that we have a queue, we'd like to say thank you, Norbert. Thank you very much for that. That was extremely First of all, I just wish I'd had a talk like that when I was doing a PhD, about help things getting published quicker. But anyway, thanks very much. It was really very
nice meeting you. See you soon.
Cheers.